The fall conference season is right around the corner, and we've got two events that you need to put on your calendar. On October 19th, we are back with Transition AI New York. Transition AI is the leading B2B event for energy practitioners and artificial intelligence experts. The New York event will explore current use cases and deployments within electric utilities, the role AI can play in streamlining project development, maximizing revenues, and integrating DERs. Plus, I'm going to do some live interviews and storytelling on stage. We'll present some deep market research, and we'll have a workshop on use cases. Our listeners get 10% off by using the promo code PSPODS10. Come join me, our journalists and researchers, and a bunch of experts in Manhattan for Transition AI. Register at the link in the show notes or go to transition-ai.com. And for you West Coasters, Canary Media is holding another Canary Live. This one is in Berkeley, California. It is on October 3rd. These events are super fun. We've hosted a couple of them with Canary. Panelists are handpicked by the Canary editorial team, and they'll dive into all things related to the energy transition, the Inflation Reduction Act, technology, and innovation. Drink, eat, socialize with clean energy leaders, investors, inventors, public leaders, and advocates. You can follow the link in the show notes to get your tickets to Canary Live Bay Area today. Transition AI New York, Canary Live Bay Area. Put them on your fall calendar for October. We'll see you there.
From the studios of Postscript Media and Canary Media.
I'm Shayle, and this is Catalyst.
The biggest problem at this point in the market's development is just getting people to understand what the heck you're doing and to get them comfortable that you're not somehow hijacking their car or going to leave them with their vehicle drained sitting as a doorstop in their driveway.
So the size of a Tesla Powerwall home battery is 14 kilowatt hours. Meanwhile, a Tesla Model 3, the vehicle, has a battery as large as 82 kilowatt hours. Or if you want to go really big, a Chevy Silverado EV, which is coming out soon, will come with a battery pack as large as 200 kilowatt hours. So you do the math on which is going to have the biggest impact on the grid.
Let's face it, environmental news is often very depressing. That's why we focus on solutions on this podcast. But still, the climate crisis looms large. Rising temperatures, mounting pollution, environmental degradation, they're all warping the planet. And for a lot of species, including us, things don't always look so great. But the story doesn't end there. Every Friday, Living Planet, a show from Deutsche Welle, takes you behind the headlines to figure out what's happening and how we'll get through it. It'll also help you make better choices for a healthy planet and find space to reconnect with the beauty and wonder of the world around us. You can find Living Planet wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Shayle. I invest in revolutionary climate technologies at Energy Impact Partners. Welcome. So when I think about the impact of electric vehicles on the grid, there's the good and there's the bad. Starting with the bad, uncontrolled charging of electric vehicles at scale could very easily start to overload portions of the distribution grid. It's not hard to imagine, and in fact, there are real examples of neighborhoods with lots of electric vehicles, everyone charging at the same time during peak hours, and effectively doubling the peak load on that circuit. Now, multiply that by the entire country, and you can imagine the problem. So that's the bad. The good comes in two parts. First, well-managed charging, where EVs soak up excess generation and flatten the overall load curve, could actually help make electricity easier to serve and potentially even less costly once levelized. And then the second thing, which is maybe the bigger deal long-term, is that EVs have these huge battery packs, much larger than most home batteries that people are starting to use for backup power. So what do you do with them? Do you offer resilience for the home? Should they discharge into the grid? Is it actually worthwhile for the customer? This nexus, how to best manage and leverage EV batteries, falls under the umbrella bucket of V2X, or vehicle to X. In some ways, it's an amalgamation of independent markets, but since they're all using the same asset, the EV battery, at the same time, while it is plugged in, they're worth considering together. And that is the job of our guest this week, Ty Jagerson. Ty is the V2X lead at General Motors. And with no further ado, Here's Ty. Ty, welcome.
Shayle, very glad to be here. Thanks for having me. This is on my bucket list.
Let's start here. We're going to talk about V2X, which is a term people throw around to mean a bunch of different things. You actually have the term in your title. V2X is in your title at GM. So what does it mean to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. It can mean different things to different folks. For us, V2X is really the business associated with what you can do with your car when it's plugged in, and the associated technologies and user experience. A lot of folks that are just poking around in this space can get confused about V2X on the electricity side versus V2X for the communication side. For vehicle-to-vehicle communications or vehicle-to-streetlight communications, that's also V2X. But this is just on the energy side, just when it's plugged in, just when it's not moving.
Okay, and so I like that frame. So things you can do with an electric vehicle when it is plugged in. So when I think about that, I think about three high-level categories, and I'm curious whether there are others that I haven't thought of. Those three being V1G, or managed charging, depending on how you want to define it. You can schedule when you charge and don't charge the vehicle. Second being V2G, which is discharge the vehicle into the grid. And the third being V2H, which is discharge the vehicle into the home, or I guess into a building, generally for backup resilience purposes. Are there others that I'm missing, or are those the three main categories as you think about it?
Those are the three main categories. People are also connecting vehicle to load, and that can be when you're plugged in or not. And you've got vehicle to building versus vehicle to other types of infrastructure, which is sort of a mashup of V2G and V2H. But basically, those are the right categories.
I will say, as an aside, I don't know, maybe a year ago, there was I think a doctor on Twitter in Texas who had, I think it was a Ford F-150 Lightning that is capable of doing V2H, and they had an outage in Texas, and he used the vehicle to power his lab. He happens to do vasectomies, so he called it V2V, which is a category I hadn't heard before, but one that we probably don't need to talk about a whole lot right now.
It's a wonder that they don't put that in more TV advertisements advertising that Ford capability.
That's right.
I think we'll see more and more stories about creative uses of the power you can get from these vehicles.
I actually think that is true, right? Like, these are big batteries, and people are just the capability to use them for things like using them to power work sites or whatever. Like, these are all new. But we'll focus on the three we talked about, starting with the one that is most straightforward, or at least most immediate, which is the V1G managed charging world. So how do you think about that world as it stands today in the sort of early days of EV adoption here?
Yeah, I think all three of those different categories are, we're still relatively early days. In the V1G category, we actually have a half dozen programs in place right now where we've partnered with utilities, and we're using these vehicles that are already in the field in customers' hands, and we're helping them use the vehicles to manage the load on the grid. The way we do that is we get the vehicle owners to pre-agree on a compensated basis to participate in these programs. And then when the utilities have a grid event, either on the spot or planned in a day or two in advance, we'll send a note to the vehicle owners, typically through the My Brand app, so the My Chevy or the My Buick app or whatever, the stuff they use every day, saying, hey, do you mind if we delay your charging tomorrow at 2 p.m.? And that's part of the program you've agreed to participate in. If they can, great. If they can't, they can always cancel that particular event. But the critical thing here is that this is driving one of the most important parts of this technology, which is the UI and the UX that creates a reasonable expectation and a comfort for participating in these programs on the part of the customer. That's an important hurdle to get over, because this is new stuff for people, and it takes them a while to get their head around how it works.
Yeah, to that point, one of the things I've wondered, I think what distinguishes this category, V1G, from the other two we're going to talk about is that the other two are sort of nice to have. They're like cool things you can do with the vehicle when it's plugged in. This one is a need to have. If we don't figure out managed charging, then there's basically no way EVs scale up to the scale that we need them to. And, clearly there are lots of different ways, permutations you could invent for how to introduce this to customers, how much to make it mandatory versus optional, and then how to compensate them for it. And I'm curious in the early days what you're seeing in terms of what it takes to get high adoption from customers. How much do we have to pay them? Or, are there clever things being done in terms of how to compensate? Like what works here?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of clever stuff being done in the space just because none of it's been done before, and everyone's just kind of trying to figure it out on the fly. The biggest problem at this point in the market's development is just getting people to understand what the heck you're doing and to get them comfortable that you're not somehow hijacking their car or going to leave them with their vehicle drained sitting as a doorstop in their driveway. And so there's a lot of education that goes into just getting people comfortable with it. The compensation side is interesting because on one hand, people are just tickled at the very idea of getting paid to provide the option for this charging curtailment to happen. But also, it's a particular vehicle owner that's available to participate in these programs we're running because it's all Bolt owners at this point for us. And the demographic of people buying Bolts is very different than the folks who are going to be buying the first Silverados coming out, the first EV Silverados coming out later this year. So you have educational requirements that are just not going to be relevant, 3 or 4 years from now. And we haven't really tested the economics of what's going to be compelling for folks going forward. But I also think that eventually the adoption rates for this stuff are going to be high just because I think it's going to be very widely accepted and everyone's going to know that they're going to get a little bit of trickle cash coming through these functions and people will just be doing it generally. I think there's some question marks around, how is that going to work with the CapEx associated with V2G versus V1G, and we can talk about that. But I wholly agree with you that this is not an optional if we're going to get to the penetration levels of renewables we're looking for and the penetration levels of EVs we're looking for, because the system's going to crack if we're not thoughtful and aggressive about these dynamics.
Yeah, the way I think about it is that ultimately there's going to be some combination of carrot and stick here. There's a little bit of both of them now, but for most customers, it's mostly carrot at this point. Let us compensate you a little bit for your managed charging. Ultimately, if that doesn't work well enough, it becomes mostly stick, and that's going to come in the form of time of use charges that are going to become really punitive if you're charging your vehicle at the wrong time.
I think that's right. My guess is that what we're going to see before too long is utility programs or state subsidy programs where your charging capacity or your utility rates are going to be charged relative to your participation in these types of programs. If you think about what's going to happen, like I remember when I was at Google and we were doing some early test demos of grid monitoring and EVs. We went to City of Palo Alto Utility, and they were like, you can't put another charger on this street. There's already 2 chargers on this street. We're like, what do you mean? Like, well, it would cost us, $50,000 to put a new pole transformer upgrade at the end of the street. So like, no more EV chargers. And I remember that time thinking like, this system is just not set up for this type of adoption, but it is set up for this type of adoption if the hardware and the software and the vehicles and the user experience are tightly aligned. And that's really what the industry is really gearing up for, is how do you do this wisely so that it's an enhancement to the grid as opposed to a destabilizing function for the grid. Right.
So I think clearly one way or another, a combination of carrot and stick, like V1G is inevitable. It's going to happen. It's going to come in lots of different forms. There are many permutations of it, right? Like timing of it and length and what are you actually asking customers to do and how do you get them to sign up and all those things. But this one seems inevitable. The other two, I guess, are a little less proven at this point. So I think for that reason, in part, more interesting to talk about. You alluded to the trade-offs with V2G, but let's just talk about like what have been the hesitations historically about V2G. There's been a lot of skepticism about it, I think, that seems to be morphing a little bit in real time.
Yeah, there's a bunch of things. One is just the public perception about the public perception, and are people going to be willing to let you do this? I kind of put that in the same category as range anxiety. I think technology is solving that problem is kind of a Y2K thing. Like just time will deal with that and people will be less worried about it. But I think also that people are willing to try things when they see that it's in their financial benefit to do so. And they're really going to be jumping on top of this because it's going to make sense for them.
What about the other area of skepticism historically has been, if you're going to discharge your vehicle battery into the grid, are you going to degrade the battery? So are you going to have a shorter lifetime on the battery, or are you going to void the warranty on the battery? And those have been fairly significant areas of hesitation, I think.
Yeah, they're big areas of hesitation, and we've looked a lot at that. And I think the consensus is that, first of all, the batteries are all getting better. And also people's understanding of how these V2G programs are going to work is also getting much more sophisticated. So a lot of that early analysis was based on batteries with less resilient life cycles. But more importantly, they were based on largely on calculations that a V2G program participation meant you were going to be slamming this thing 100% up and down and fully discharging and charging twice a day. This is not how it's going to work. I mean, this is the value of these batteries is going to be more in the power than in the energy. And it's going to be more in the capacity than in the kWh, right? So you're going to have the value is that these things are going to be available and, maybe sometimes used for a little bit of peak shaving, but not for gunning the whole thing up and down in most cases. Now, in some cases, that might be what's going on if you're in a really stressed part of the grid. But we'll be able to track that and we'll know way ahead of time whether or not the charging activity is remotely at risk for impinging on the warranty requirements. And if you're making that much money, which you will be, if the grid is really that needy for all that power, then there'll be a financial option for people to opt out of the warranty or buy an upgrade or whatever it is. But the financial circumstances will reward that, and we just got to figure that out.
There's an interesting point in there that you should think of batteries from the grid's perspective, EV batteries from the grid's perspective, as being more of a capacity resource than an energy resource, which means basically, they may not be discharging all the time, except for in those cases, like you said, that they're in a particularly stressed part of the grid, but the grid can count on them being there when they need it, or when the grid needs it, rather, which is an interesting point when you think about an electric vehicle battery, right? I mean, batteries alone have struggled to get capacity value in electricity markets, even stationary batteries, because it's been a process to get grid operators sort of comfortable with the notion that they can be counted on and available as a capacity resource. A mobile battery presumably is even more difficult to count on in that regard. Do I know for sure that this person's going to be home with sufficient capacity in their battery to charge? I assume the way that you get around that is in aggregate, right? And you just assume that across a large enough aggregation of vehicles, some of them will be there. But how much do we still have to prove in terms of being able to quantify the capacity value of these batteries?
Yeah, if you look at statistically how reliable any given vehicle is going to be, any given vehicle, you can't count on it at all. But we're going to be putting millions of vehicles out in the field, and so are other companies. And it doesn't take too long before, that's gigawatts of power. And it doesn't take too long before you'll strike this relatively functional balance of real capacity and real customer response time. So you'll be able to know what it is. I mean, a coal plant is 80, 90% uptime and reliability if you call on it in a certain time zone. Well, if you've got 1 million vehicles and you've got a track record on how those vehicles perform over the last 20 events, it's kind of like thermostats. I think probably 10 years ago, people were saying thermostats just foundationally are not dispatchable resources. And now we know that, if you have 1 million thermostats and you've done it 20 times, then actually it's more dispatchable than a discrete peaking resource. And I think you're going to find that with vehicles as well. It's going to be very fungible. It's going to be very predictable. We're going to know exactly where they are in the grid. And then people say they're going to move around. Geez, Yeah, they're going to move around, and they're going to move around in a way that's predictable. And, for those use cases or capacities which are slightly less reliable, there'll just be a different discount variable on that capacity pricing.
The other question with V2G, which is also, we talked about it with V1G, but I think it's probably even more of a question here is compensation and value to the customer. Because there's obviously a difference between asking the customer, can I delay your charging 3 hours at 2 p.m. tomorrow versus can I discharge your battery into the grid and thus you will actually have less charge in the battery until we recharge it. What do we know about compensation requirements for V2G and is there enough juice there? Like, is the value to the grid sufficient to pay for whatever that compensation is going to be required to the customer, plus whatever margin, the intermediary, be it GM or somebody else, is going to command in the middle?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite thinking points around V to G, which is that a lot of people think like, well, okay, there's X value in a certain vehicle or a certain market of vehicles for V1G, and if you can reverse the charge, well, then it's twice as valuable. But it's actually not twice as valuable. It's much more than twice as valuable. If you think about V1G value, it's only a megawatt capacity if the vehicle is not charged. And a lot of times what happens, people bring their vehicle someplace, they plug it in and it's charged. And so you've got basically megawatt capacity for as long as it's sitting there, either charging or maybe about to be charging. But if you have V2G, then it's got capacity in some form available for the entire time that it's plugged in. Because most of the time you'll be able to take a little bit of power out, and you can also defer from a potential charge happening. And so if you think about, there's going to be, for V1G, there's millions of cars out there, a very large percentage of which are not useful to the grid at all because they're already charged. So it's not just double. It's like, and the math can be done several ways, but it's really 3 or 4 times as valuable for a given vehicle. So in my mind, V1G is valuable because it allows us to craft these pathways through which we can track the data, track the economics, get customers comfortable with the very idea of their grid being their vehicle being a fungible grid asset. And then from the customer perspective, it's just not that much of a bigger leap to go from V1G to V2G, even though it's a bigger technical leap. It's just like, hey, the emotional impact of, hey, tomorrow at 2 p.m., do you mind if I make sure you're not charging versus, hey, tomorrow at 2 p.m., I'm going to take you down from 100% to 80% or 80% to 75% or something, and I'm going to throw you, a 10 spot. Is that cool? That for me is really where the impact comes in here. When I think of the impact of the vehicles on the grid, it's really what you can do with the V2G that really gives it that exponential pop.
Where are we in the development of that V2G as a market? Like V1G, there's, you said you've got half a dozen programs around the country. I mean, there are dozens of them out there. It's happening. Often the times they're pilot programs and so on, but it's pretty widespread, at least across the U.S. Where are we with V2G?
So there have been some pilots going on with V2G. We've demonstrated our vehicles in V2G mode. We don't have any programs going with utilities for V2G mode, but I think the expectation in the industry is that what happens is these existing programs with utilities just roll right into V2G programs. And so, there are additional hardware requirements, and so you've got to have that commensurate additional economic benefit. And partly for that reason, I think you're going to see a geographic distribution of these programs that is energy market driven. When you look at the economic value of V1G or a V2G vehicle, it's a function of the energy prices and the volatility in a given market. So high renewables and hence high volatility markets are going to be the places where you're going to see not just V1G, but V2G. And then you're also going to see spiky activity in states where they incentivize this ahead of other states. I mean, you've been watching this field for as long as anybody. And, all of a sudden some state comes out of nowhere and all of a sudden they're the hotspot for a given technology. We'll see that happening here as well.
I do remember that in the early days of solar, particularly for distributed solar, right? There'd be like random state X would suddenly introduce some rebate program for residential solar.
And it would get a watt.
Exactly. And it would get filled up in like 20 minutes. And then all of a sudden it would pop and be like the largest market for a month until the subsidy ran out.
Yeah. We used to have sales folks go and hang out at City Hall waiting for the rebates to open. There'd be like a long line. It'd be like a fancy concert and people like queuing up outside to get this crazy rebate.
Right.
The next day.
Yeah, exactly. Talk a little bit more about the hardware requirements. I mean, that is one difference. Well, I guess on both sides, like from a technology standpoint, what is required in order to do managed charging and what is required in order to do V2G? Because they're sort of different.
Yeah. So for managed charging, all you need to do is be able to you need to be able to stop the charging. And so you can do that through the charging equipment, or you could do telematics through the vehicle. And depending on who you're talking to in the industry, one is the perfect answer and the other is the perfect answer. I think our perspective is you get the most flexibility if you can control it on the car, because the car is going to go different places, and you could, one point of connection gives you V1G capabilities anywhere you go. So technically V1G is pretty simple on that front. With V2G, you've got power flowing backwards into a source that might otherwise normally just be flowing energy out. So you need to have that shut off capability, and you need to have a system which is engineered to be able to allow bidirectional power flow, at least at that point of interconnection. So there is additional complexity there. One of the things that we're seeing is that the places where there's the strongest interest for V2G, you're already going through a process where maybe you're adding some additional storage at the building, and oftentimes being paired with solar, which really gives you these really powerful positive feedback loops between the solar, the on-site storage, and the vehicle storage. Which really provides some nice benefits in terms of resilience and cost effectiveness, and that helps defray the cost of the V2G if you were doing a V2G only solution for just the vehicle.
That's a good segue actually into the third category, which is V2H or vehicle to building or something like that, because as you said, lots of folks are installing stationary batteries to provide resilience or backup or something like that. Lots of the same folks are buying electric vehicles, which have much, much larger batteries that are sitting there generally unutilized, and could provide much more backup power potentially. And so the promise of V2H, or whatever we want to call it, is why do you need the stationary battery? You've got a much bigger battery in your vehicle. If you're willing to give up on some range, which we should probably talk about, then in the event of an outage, use your vehicle to power the home. How high a priority is that for you guys?
So it's a really high priority for us to be able to deliver a full home solution for our vehicle customers. And that is what we're going to be rolling out with the Silverado, is you'll be able to pick up not just the storage, but all the additional charging infrastructure, but also solar through our SunPower partnership. And so you'll be able to get a full home ecosystem with the vehicle. And I think that's really important for folks. I think the number of times people use V2H is going to be low. The amount of emotional equity that they put in the comfort of having a home that's resilient, and for some people it matters also if it's renewably powered, but it's amazing how much zeitgeist there is around vehicles powering your home, and that sort of providing this dramatic enhancement to resilience for the homeowner. And it's real. Like the number of outages we have around the country, and you guys have done a lot of segments on this around, the aging grid, now with, a lot more volatile resources on it, more climate change. There's just going to be more outages. And I think, everyone going out and getting a generator is not the solution. This is going to be a very compelling solution, and it sort of matches the needs of the time. So I think it's going to be very powerful, and that's why we're putting a lot of time and energy into coming up with a really cool package that offers that.
In your mind, ultimately, does it displace stationary batteries used for resilience? Like, is there any reason why you'd still want or need a power wall or whatever it might be if you've got 5 times the capacity in your vehicle that you can use?
Yeah, people still want to be able to drive their car in the, when the zombie apocalypse hits or a hurricane or something else. You still got to go out and buy bread or, do what you got to do. And it's not ideal that your refrigerator turns off when someone drives down to get new sandbags or whatever for the home. But I think also the other benefit of the battery is that when the vehicle isn't there, your battery is earning its salary by being this load management asset and doing other grid balancing stuff. And if you've got solar, then you're aware of all the different legal challenges coming up to some of the solar pricing structures around the country. Those actually enhance the economic value of batteries. So the battery installation is really an important sort of workhorse for the home energy management ecosystem. And as more and more municipalities move towards electrification mandates, that just becomes even more critical. So I think economics are generally moving very powerfully in favor of home batteries with or without V2G. And again, the combination of those two is particularly compelling.
Stepping back, I guess. So presuming we like all 3 of these categories ultimately, and we think that people who have EVs in the long term will probably need to do some managed charging. They'll maybe want to do some vehicle to grid, and they will certainly like to be able to back up their home with their vehicle if they can. My presumption is these are not ultimately 3 separate markets. This is one holistic managed charging thing. So I have my vehicle and I'm interacting with somebody, and somebody is sort of in the background trying to figure out at any given time what I should be doing with that battery if it's plugged in. How do you think about the ecosystem around that ultimately? What is the role that OEMs like GM should play? Who else needs to be in that ecosystem? Where do we land from a market structure perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is still a very early market. There's a lot of folks out there that have developed a big name for it, but the space is just going to grow and grow, and there's a lot of folks that want a piece of it. You've got competitors ranging from, the solar companies want to get more of a piece. The Generacs of the world, they're like, wait, we're the storage people, and so everything should be coming through us. You got, Google and Amazon who are out there trying to say wait a minute, we're the home communications interface people, so all those devices really need to be coming through Siri or Alexa or whatever else. And then you've got, umpteen home energy management, standalone independent device companies. So I think it's really an outstanding question as to what that final structure looks like. But I think the reason that there's so much push for this is I don't think that every home is going to have 5 or 6 home energy management apps. You're just not going to do it. You're not going to sell availability on your refrigerator's capacity to one utility and then have, your CCA take the capacity on your vehicle, and all those things have to talk to each other and be managed basically as a homogeneous load. So that suggests that there's going to be a lot of participants and not that many interfaces between the customer and the energy market, whether that's utility or some other aggregated market transaction. There's a funny analogy we use on my team, which is you ever see Hunger Games?
Sure.
In Hunger Games, and the hero and everyone comes up and they're up on those pillars, and everyone's sort of looking around at each other, and everyone's trying to figure out what's going to happen out in the field. Well, I think we're kind of at that stage of the market where everybody has to both compete with each other, but also cooperate with each other. And that's what you're seeing. We have an enormous amount of partnerships, and we're building more and more because no one's going to be able to do everything. And so you have to have an open ecosystem where you're pairing with folks to make sure your customer is getting the best experience, and then making sure that you're participating in a win. Our solutions have to work wherever our vehicles work, and that's everywhere. And we're not going to provide the same amount of functionality in every location, but the vehicle still has to be able to capture that benefit, and we have to make sure they get it.
I assume you're the Katniss Everdeen in that metaphor.
We represent the common good across that ecosystem.
Of course,
picking specific characters.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is very illuminating, and these are all markets, or ultimately one unified market that is going to develop, I think, quickly over the coming years. So we'll have much more to talk about. But in the meantime, Ty, thank you so much for doing this.
Shayle, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Ty Jagerson is the V2X lead at General Motors. This show is a co-production of Postscript Media and Canary Media. You can head over to canarymedia.com for links to topics on today's show. Postscript is supported by Prelude Ventures, a venture capital firm that partners with entrepreneurs to address climate change across a range of sectors, including advanced energy, food and ag, transportation and logistics, advanced materials and manufacturing, and advanced computing. This episode was produced by Daniel Waldorf. Mixing by Roy Campanella and Sean Marquand. Theme song by Sean Marquand. I'm Shayle Khan, and this is Catalyst.